Recording in progress.
I'm getting a bit of an echo, so I think someone might need to be on mute. Okay. So we've done arrivals, we've done introduction. I'm going to spend the next 40 minutes or so kind of walking through the various things we've done, what we've learned, and combining that with some of the things we've learned in some of the state and Chicago-based projects that Ben mentioned, and how we think those pieces could start to fit together to fit the needs and priorities of the greater East St. Louis community. Then we'll take a break. So you can take some time, do whatever you need to do, jot your questions down, and we'll come back and have a discussion and answer any questions. Of course, if you have any clarifying questions along the way, things aren't making sense, please do stop me and let me know. But we'll save most of the substantive questions and the discussion for the later section. And then we'll just wrap up at the end with Kaylin there at the end. So we have 90 minutes, we have until 3:30 and we'll have a lot of different directions we'll go and a lot of different topics we'll get into. So like I said, the beginning of a conversation, by no means the end. So I'll start with, the first thing we wanted to do was understand where we were starting in the greater East St. Louis community with respect to data, the use of data in current work, and how data could shape future work. And so I'll go past these first couple of slides pretty quickly because I imagine they're quite familiar to most people here on this call, if not everyone, related to the geography and the demographics of this community. I think what also isn't a surprise to know some of these statistics that are here on this slide related to the fact that, because of historic disinvestment, there are challenges related to poverty, to access to resources, but there are also strong assets related to community-based organizations, churches, nonprofits, et cetera, that have really stood in some of those gaps and provided not only great services, but also created great infrastructure for collaboration in this community, which is part of what we're hoping to build on with this project. Early learning takes a variety of forms. However, the evidence does suggest that there is still remaining support that is needed to address the needs of families and students. We also wanted to take a deep dive into understanding what kind of work has happened in this community already with respect to large-scale data projects, and how has that been used, what's worked well, what hasn't worked as well, and where could something like this not reinvent the wheel, but build upon those learnings. So the first thing I'll mention is the EDI, the Early Development Instrument that was developed in partnership with the Erickson Institute. Many of you may be familiar with this, many of you may have played a part in this. This project mapped vulnerabilities, they were called, across 5 different developmental domains, and they were created as maps. So it was very geographically based, and it was updated twice in 2016 and 2019. What we learned through various conversations with folks in the community about this particular project is that, of course, it showed a high level of willingness and eagerness to engage in some of these large-scale projects, to develop tools and expertise related to building these community-level insights. However, there were also some concerns about whether or not the information that was produced was as accessible or as actionable as it could have been. And also we learned that there's even more interest in having, to the best of our ability, accurate, current, up-to-date data. The other thing that we're building upon and in conversation with as we talk about this work is something that's happened under the umbrella of Eastside Aligned in the Youth Development Alliance. So for the last several years, they've had experience working with the School District 189, linking after-school program participation and in-school data for those same students involved in those programs. And what we've learned through this effort is that, those negotiations and that process of sharing data between after-school programs and school districts was actually relatively straightforward and has been a productive and strong relationship since it started. We've also learned, not unexpectedly, that the different after-school providers come with a wide range of comfort and skill levels when it comes to receiving that data from the school district and turning it into actionable insights. We learned that, especially in the early days of a relationship like this, there can be manual, time-intensive steps. And so looking for ways to smooth over some of those bumps is a priority. And we also learned that, there's a lot of analysis that can be done, but there are limits when it comes to, how much capacity and time there is to put into that, that kind of reporting and analysis. So with that being said, those are all things that we're thinking of going into this project. And so we started to have a series of conversations. Some of those were with people on this call. All in all, we gathered perspectives from a wide range of stakeholders in this community, roughly 25 folks, coming from surveys, one-on-one interviews, small group focus groups. And this ranged from early learning providers, family liaisons, school district leadership, folks from the regional birth to 5 leadership. So a wide range of backgrounds. And what we learned was that there's actually a good amount of consensus related to the potential benefit for having more and better data related to both individual programs, but more importantly, at times, the community as a whole. And in particular, there were 3 major areas that came out of these conversations. The first was the idea that there are ways that we can create more and better evidence for state and local policy interventions. So making the case for changes in a variety of different areas. The second was creating and gathering insights that can improve programming day to day. And the final one was gathering evidence and gathering metrics that can be used to access additional funding within the community. So to go a little bit deeper into those 3 areas, another way to think about it is a division between how data can help community members interact with external stakeholders, external to their program, and even external to the greater East St. Louis area, and then the impact it has internally. So first, speaking externally, a lot of folks, particularly those who had firsthand experience working with lawmakers, working with funders, noted the impact and the strong appetite that those decision makers have for particularly quantitative data. And so that was something that those folks that I spoke to said that, even when they come armed with a lot of qualitative data, having that extra backbone of the quantitative data could really be impactful in swaying decisions that could really have material impacts for the local community. Another thing that came up with respect to the external stakeholders is that, just by their very nature, they're not going to be as close to the day-to-day work in the community. They're not going to have that lived experience of what's happening day to day. And so when there are gaps between, what might be a known fact or a common experience might not be reflected in the current data that we have. One example of this was the rates of ASQ screenings that are actually performed versus those that are formally reported and captured. And so those are ways in which the conversations have come out to say, well, one of the big benefits is that this will help us in our interactions externally. But there were also many points that came up that could have a great impact internally as well. So could help at a community level, think about how we more effectively target resources, attention, programming, time. But also thinking of this as a complement to the rich qualitative knowledge that exists, here in the community, not as something that's trying to replace it. So really, particularly internally, making sure there's that balance between the lived experience, the qualitative knowledge that exists widely, and being able to produce quantitative data that can support, add nuance, and also be helpful in a variety of different types of decisions and interactions. So it wasn't only benefits that were discussed, but there were also some concerns. The 2 biggest ones, when you bubble them up, come down to, can we do this? Do we have the capacity to take on a big data project like this? Various people would say, well, as part of the state and nationwide trends, there are staff shortages, there's turnover in the workforce, there's perhaps lack of access to professional development. So how do we expect to be able to do something new? or there's concerns about this being sustainable, whether this is going to be something or could be something that comes and goes, and that being a concern, particularly when thinking about investing community-wide effort into something like changing the approach to the use of data. The second thing that came up was, even if we successfully create a system that gives us access to more data at the community level, do we actually have what it takes to turn that into actionable insights? And that comes back to a couple of things. It comes back to, do stakeholders, decision makers throughout the system, so from parents to program administrators to community organization leaders, have data literacy skills that they need to actually make those translations between the numbers on the page and making an impact in the life, the day-to-day life of students, of families, of staff. And, can we make sure that we're reporting in ways that are accessible and meaningful to a wide range of folks? And so these are valid concerns, but by no means insurmountable. So as we go through, you'll see some of these themes come up again in ways that some of these concerns can be mitigated and surpassed. So the next thing that we'll talk about is what this could actually look like. How do we translate some of these priorities, some of these themes that we heard throughout the community, and think about what they could look like in the future? Before I do that, though, I want to pause and just see if anyone has any clarifying questions or thoughts so far before we move on.
Alexis, would it be okay if people put questions in the chat box as we go along?
Absolutely, that would be great. So no need to lose them if you're waiting for the end. We can put them there, and Kaylin graciously offered to help moderate the chat. So yeah, feel free to put those there. All right, I'll keep moving then. So translating from where we are today to where we could be in the future comes back to what came out of some of the key themes from the conversations that I had and the survey that we did. I asked people, what is something that you would want to know more about that you don't currently have access to the right information to answer that question today? And across the variety of responses to that question, there were three things that came out the clearest. The first was related to enrollment. Do we actually have a clear picture of who is enrolled in services in our community, where those services are provided, what type of services they are? And also, moving on to the second, do these services that are available match the needs of our families and children in the area? And finally, what came up is, are we sufficiently preparing and supporting our staff to be able to support families, support children, and actually, deliver high quality services throughout the community, and also, build their own careers and livelihoods. So expanding upon this in the second page here, within each priority area, as you'll see, there are some breakdowns of some more specific data points or questions that came up within these three theme areas. So not only what is the overall enrollment, but how does that break down by certain priority populations? Within the area of family needs, what is the unmet demand, especially for non-traditional services or non-traditional hours even? What is the degree of kindergarten readiness? And for workforce preparation, do we have a full picture of not only who is in the early learning workforce, but to what degree they are having access to continuing education, to the skills they need to do their job well, and to also grow and progress in their careers. And so taking that into account, and also learning from what has happened in other places, for example, has been mentioned, the state level system, the Chicago level system. This is a vision of what could be to start answering some of those questions. This can look a little complicated at first glance, so we'll spend a moment talking through each of these pieces. In the middle, in gray, you have this idea of a shared data system, something like a shared technology base where data from a variety of sources can be put together, to be analyzed together, to be able to answer questions that are not just, looking at Head Start data or school district data or data from one home center, but can be across the community. And that's a system that would have relationships in terms of both inputs and also outputs with two main types of actors at the local level. Those are the ones in lighter purple. The first, of course, are the individual providers, who would both be a source of data into the system, but also would be able to get something back in the form of these digest or reports that can help them understand more about what's happening within their site and within their programs. And also this idea of a governing body, which would be more of an entity that looks across the system, is more focused on reporting and understanding trends at the community level, and also is responsible for shaping the system in terms of highlighting what gets collected year to year, understanding what other stakeholders, whether it's, as we'll get to, from the state, the governor's office, state agencies, how those interact with the system. And it's just a day-to-day first point of contact for anyone who might have questions about or want to engage with this system. And providers, of course, would have a voice in that entity, but it would be some form of collaborative body that's responsible for the maintaining and looking across the system, not just at any one given site. On the right here in the darker purple, you see this box that says governor's office and state agencies. What this means is that there are ways that there actually can also be inflows and outflows of information from the local to the more regional and state level. This could be, of course, interest in terms of wanting to understand what the outcomes were of some of this analysis, but also there are ways that the state and regional areas might be able to be inputs into the system. What this means is, as been mentioned earlier in the introduction, there is data that's already in the process of being collected at the state level. One thing that we could explore further is, to what degree are there ways that actually there's information that the state has that can inform the local analysis that doesn't have to be replicated or can't really be accessed as easily in the local capacity? So are there ways that those two systems can be supportive of each other? That's an open question. That's work that's still ongoing, but that's something that in the future, we would want to spend more time exploring. So that's the whole ecosystem of how these various pieces, both at the local level and even a little bit further away at the state and regional level, can collaborate to really help us answer some of these questions about what's happening at the community level and how can we use it to make outcomes better for everyone involved. Now, I've talked about something that's definitely not going to happen overnight. That's more mature target state view of the future. And it still requires, a lot of decisions to be made. Even within that structure, there are still variations that could exist depending on where you are or what the priorities of a given community are in terms of how it works. And so there are various spectrums, you could call it, of that there still need to be decisions made related to what will this look like in East St. Louis. And also, not only is there the target state to think about, but there's the steps along the way. And so there's making a decision about what our ambition is along each of these spectrums, but where is it that we can realistically start? And how do we progress along these spectrums for where we can start to where we want to end up? And so I'll just give you one example, a couple of these examples. So if we look at the second one here that says tech, analog on one side, tech driven on the other. There are perhaps some very sophisticated, complicated systems that could be used to automate a lot of this work. And on the other end, there could be very manual, time-consuming ways to achieve similar outcomes. And there are various constraints, both in terms of time, in terms of money, that would limit, where you might fall on this spectrum. So there's a decision about where do we ultimately want to be. It might not actually, be that we want to end up all the way on the right side, even in the target state, for various reasons. Let's say we want to end up 3/4 of the way there, and we believe that right now we can be 50% of the way there. So part of it is knowing that, and then part of it is doing the planning work of what are the steps we can take over the next couple of years to move along from where we are to where we would want to be. And so that's how we're thinking about understanding both adding more richness to what the target state could be, but also thinking proactively about the interim steps in between there. And so the same kind of exercise be repeated for these various other spectrums related to, how narrow is the scope in terms of what's collected, what's analyzed, towards how broad could it be? How infrequent versus how frequent would you want to update the data, report on the data, et cetera. Moving on. So as there are all of these decisions to be made down the line, one thing that's important to keep in mind to help make those decisions are some of these key principles, what we would call design principles, which is landed at these four, thinking about why we would want to do something like this and what the overall objectives would be. And so to give you a little bit more clarity on that, the first one, generative, we put this here as a design principle to represent the idea that the purpose of increasing the use of community level data is about seeking insights, seeking solutions, and seeking improvement. The goal is not about placing blame, pointing fingers, or taking any form of punitive action. This is meant to be something that is generative for the community and not about and never punitive. Similarly, one of the foundational values going into this work is about equity and making sure the collection use of data is focused on identifying and addressing systemic inequalities. Collaboration is also a core value and something that could help think through, as you're making decisions about the structure of a system like this, these design principles would suggest that we would prefer one that recognizes that working together and sharing is essential to achieving, individual and shared objectives. And finally, we also, especially anything where you're considering data and data of students, families, staff, making sure privacy is adequately protected and that there's sufficient control over how data is used. So it can be used to shared ends, but never in a way that puts anyone's information at undue risk. So these are some of the kind of core principles that could be used in weighing these trade-offs between these various dimensions. So two other things that we're thinking about as we think about what this vision for a system could be. One thing that came up time and time again from a variety of different stakeholders is making sure that family and community stakeholders, so not necessarily folks that are working in one of these programs or working in an organization like ELP, but have a real stake because their kids are going to these programs, their nieces, their nephews, their neighbors are part of these programs and they have a vested interest in their futures. How can we make sure that they have meaningful and structured participation along the way? So these are some options for ways that participation can be included. So whether it's making sure there are opportunities for people to have access to data literacy education, to feel like they can be more actively involved in these kind of conversations, to doing workshops once we're at a state where there is data to look at, doing workshops to interpret data collaboratively. In terms of evaluating and making decisions for future years of a program like this, involving all types of stakeholders, including families and communities, in reevaluating and refining the priorities that go into the system for the next year, the next data collection. And working with, supporting the existing advocacy of families and communities with data that's generated from a program like this and being partners in that work. So that's a starting list. There are probably other ways that we can loop a variety of stakeholders in, but that's a starting point. The other thing we wanted to make sure we talk about when thinking about what this vision is for the future is how this information gets communicated out. That's also part of involving a wide range of stakeholders. And at its foundation, there's two major types of reporting that we're thinking about right now. The first is the community level reporting, which would be more, if you think back to that other diagram, the responsibility of the governing body. This is where you're looking at the aggregate community-wide footprint, you're doing things like comparing it to census data to understand, okay, this analysis says we're serving X number of families, but we know that actually there are this many more in our area. It can be broken out, of course, by geography, by age, by race, and something that would likely be released annually. Now, the second type is the more operational type of dashboard, and this is what's going to be more at the individual provider site level. So this is more specific to a specific provider. It's not necessarily automatically shared publicly. That would be more at the discretion of that individual provider, but it helps them understand, what parts of their programming or operations are working well, how things are changing over time. It may, include some benchmarks, other type of providers in the community to help them understand, where they might have strengths versus challenges. And it also could be something that supports work they already do with respect to annual deliverables for grants, annual reports that they put out to the community, et cetera. So those are how we're thinking about making sure this information gets shared back, and also it is useful for the community writ large. So the next section, before I move on, Caitlin, anything in the chat that we should address before we move on?
It looks like they're more high-level questions, but Janice and Kevin, I want to open it up. If you would like responses now, that's totally appropriate too.
Hey, this is Kevin. Yes, my statement was about the slide that you presented on the path forward, with, where we are and ideally where we like to be, and getting to where we'd like to be based on, the budgets of different stakeholders. There might be a hurdle in getting from one end of that spectrum to the next, because you would have to have some kind of synchronicity in the collection of the data, and that may not be possible. And where there might be synchronicity, you may not have the manpower, which is something that you mentioned before. And so that would, become a hindrance to that collection of data. So I think there needs to be an agreement on which types of collection tools can be used across the board with the least expense to all parties.
Absolutely. And I think, Kevin, you've landed on exactly what will be one of a focus going forward. So not something we've gone too deep into here, but is of incredible importance. As I did mention, there will always be constraints related to what you would do if you had no constraints versus what you do with constraints. But also, I think to your point, the most expensive option or the most time-intensive option is not always going to be the best one. We have to think about what are the priorities, what makes most sense to meet those needs and priorities, and it may not be the 100% version on any given dimension. It might be something more in the middle that balances, achieving the ends that have been prioritized collaboratively by the community, and also balancing the competing priorities in terms of resources that are also being faced. So that you're exactly spot on there.
Alexis, if you wouldn't mind me adding, I think you've captured it really well, that this is really one of the most important conversations going forward that Kevin's raised here. And I think one of the things that we're going to want to discuss moving forward is how can we leverage some of the efforts that are going on at the state and perhaps other communities that are going to allow us to create efficiencies for the community here in East St. Louis. And so, our hope is that this is not something that the community is doing on its own, but is done in coordination with some other efforts that ease some of the resource needs that are being described here.
Okay, I'll keep us moving then. I noticed Janice's point said can address later. So the next section that we wanted to talk to you about is a little bit more of the how. You know, who's doing what? How do we keep these pieces in coordination? Which gets the idea of governance. So in this part, the first thing is roles and responsibilities, kind of just a little bit more definition on what these various components are going to be would be responsible for doing, at least in the model that was described a few slides ago. So this governing body, and we'll talk about this a little bit more on the next slide, you know, has responsibilities for convening the various stakeholders in the community to discuss, you know, changes, you know, strategy for collection. It would be most responsible for publishing and helping interpret those community level findings, and also serves as, you know, a general point of contact for whether it's, you know, a local community member, a state lawmaker, a researcher, any other interested party that wants to kind of engage with this work, you know, would serve as that point of contact. Thinking about, you know, the local providers, their main, you know, responsibility is going to be related to providing access to their operational data, and being active participants in terms of, you know, giving their inputs to the governing body, participating in professional development as it's offered or as it's, you know, as it's needed to support the system, and then continue to do their best to act upon information that comes about from this work in their day-to-day operations. And finally, when we think about the state and regional agencies, you know, there's active and ongoing work about how can work that's happening at the state level in other communities be in support of work that might happen in other local areas. And so it would be their responsibility to, of course, to continue to do that work and potentially, you know, fill in certain gaps where it's actually more efficient for the state, you know, longitudinal data system to provide certain data points back to the local community versus try to be collected again locally. In the future, again, it also could be, as this community level reporting is available, to use that in their decision making with respect to policy and resource allocation would be the hope down the line as well. So going into this idea, digging more into what does a governing body mean, we started putting some thoughts on paper about, you know, who could fill that slot. And the way we thought about it is this spectrum here of, you know, where's there more existing infrastructure for this kind of idea or this kind of work, and where is there less? So at the very left-hand side, where there's the least existing infrastructure, would be the idea of starting up something brand new. You know, this could have its benefits of, you know, you could design it for exactly what the system that is being, you know, designed would want or need. It might be seen as unbiased because it's bespoke for this particular cause, but, you know, that would take a lot more time, and you would still need to establish, you know, the credibility, the trust for any new organization has to build up getting started. You know, we also thought about, you know, is this something that a big provider group like Head Start or even the school district could take on? You know, for example, a big reason for that is that they have probably the most experience with student level data. They have a lot of access to that for their students, and they do analysis on that. However, it's pretty out of scope for them. Their job is to work with their students, you know, and collaborate at times, but it would be a bit of a stretch to suddenly be working in this initiative where they're overseeing kind of the integration of data across the whole community and across a variety of providers. And there's also potential to be seen as biased in one way or the other, given that it would be one, you know, type of provider kind of in the center seat. Another possibility is the regional birth to 5 infrastructure that's a little bit newer and being built out at the state level, but also at the regional level. We're lucky to have the leader from Region 50 for St. Clair County on the line as well. And so, you know, one benefit is that, you know, they are doing some work related to data. They do have ties to state agencies, resources. However, you know, they also have a larger footprint. Their scope goes beyond just the greater East St. Louis area. And also, they're also early in their existence as an organization and are working through what their priorities are. And so, there's potentially some friction there about whether or not that would be the right fit. And finally, on the furthest right-hand side here, thinking about ESA, East Side Aligned, or more specifically underneath that, the Early Learning Partnership. It's an existing organization that has, of course, existing relationships across a variety of types of stakeholders in the community, including all of us gathered here today. It has relevant experience insofar as its mission and work is cross-cutting across different types of providers, different parts of the community geographically, demographically, would be relatively aligned to its existing mission, but it's not necessarily an owner of some of this data, or could be seen as, there are other reasons why it might not be seen as the most authoritative or best fit for this kind of work. So the end all be all of this slide is that there might not be a perfect answer, but depending on what the values are in terms of what we're prioritizing, whether it's speed of getting started, whether it's a certain type of experience with data, a certain type of experience working across the community, there are different ways that you could think about where you slot in a governing body. So in my particular analysis here, I did put ESA and ELP on the far right side for a reason, with the conclusion being they have the most existing infrastructure, but that again, there might be a different judgment call made related to what that priority might be. But on the right hand side here for the reasons that are listed here. So that's governance. The last major chunk that we'll discuss before moving into the break and then questions is, what's some of the action steps that could be happening in the next first year and then longer term after that. So the bulk of the conversation is related to what could we do sooner? What could be initiatives that could be achieved within the next fiscal year? So there's 5 items listed here, and I'll go into a little bit more detail each of them. One is related to professional development and data literacy. One is related to convening local stakeholders and doing a form of data sharing that might not be the full system that we've discussed in this vision statement before. Continuing the partnership with Ed Systems, connecting data questions and policy advocacy, and finally, leveraging the internal governance work and transition of ESA into its own organization to integrate some of that data work further. So we'll dive into each of those, starting with investing in provider PD. So this came up early and it came up often in the conversations I had, which is that, there are some folks who are, quite skilled and quite comfortable with using data. And there are others who, don't really know where to begin. And so, there is work that could happen, even before a different type of system is in place that helps people be more comfortable with even the existing level of data that's out there and gets them into the practice and the culture of being data driven in their analysis, in their work. And so professional development around data literacy and education could focus on a variety of topics, including, what are the different types of data that are out there? Why does it matter? How we can use it to support our equity ambitions, how you actually go from looking at data on a page to actually identifying true insights, how you make data part of your culture, and different methods for collaborating with various stakeholders on data and community. So that's a kind of idea of what could be focused on, and some of the screenshots here of the slides are some examples from materials that other colleagues at NIU have worked on that speak to some of these same ideas about what's the importance of data, particularly in education. And the point I'll just land there is that, data is not just about numbers or about, the trend of, well, everyone says they're data driven now. It's ultimately about, increasing our capacity for working with data so that we can take data-driven actions that are ultimately serving, and focus on results for students, for families. So keeping that end goal in mind can help motivate and support the underlying work that's done about how to actually use it. The second potential initiative we'll talk more is a type of interim approach, which would be sharing more synthesized data. So the system that we discussed, the vision would be what would be shared and would be centralized would be student level data. So in that centralized analysis, you would be able to look at the child level and understand, for example, what proportion of students of X demographic fall in Y group. So under this approach, though, you wouldn't have that. You wouldn't have that bringing together student level data, but you could have different providers through an MOU with ELP, for example, report on a specific set of analyses and data points that they would define collaboratively. And then so that would enable ELP to produce and share back a community level picture of enrollment and other key indicators. And it has some strengths in the sense that it's faster to stand up. There might be fewer privacy concerns, might take less upfront effort, but it does have some drawbacks as well. It limits the possible analyses and the types of questions you'd be able to answer. There is a certain risk if the data is being analyzed in separate places before it's brought together of there being some inconsistencies and errors. And it could require more time and effort to actually do that consolidation if doing something like this. However, this could be an approach that is a stepping stone in terms of building the culture, building the practice of using data in a more collaborative way that could be a stepping stone to a more centralized system down the line. So that's one potential initiative or one approach that could happen relatively quickly. The third that we'll talk about is things that NIU, Ed Systems, and ELP can continue to do over the next, through the end of the year and even beyond. One is continuing to exchange learnings about some of the state and regional data initiatives that could have implications for what is possible at the local level. The next is continuing to engage with different community stakeholders to further understand what the top priorities are, the top restraints, considerations are. The third would be continuing to go deeper into understanding the technological solution capabilities that exist, again, like at the state level or just are currently well known and well studied against what those priorities that are established in East St. Louis are. The fourth would be to continue to get more into the weeds of the feasibility of the data transfers from the various different types of local providers that are in the area. And finally, getting to the point that Kevin brought up earlier is thinking very critically about what does this look like as a sustainable initiative? What are the different types of resources that can be pulled together to make sure this is something that can last and can grow over time? The fourth potential short-term initiative is starting to make explicit links in the work that ELP does, that other groups in the area do, related to between data and policy advocacy. There's certainly already work in this respect happening. And so as the data and centralized knowledge continues to grow, using that to support some of these things that would enable the outcomes and the areas that are named as priorities in the system. So that was a little bit abstract. I'll use an actual example to unpack that a little bit more. So for example, one of the three goal areas is workforce preparedness and support. So how can we go from either a hypothesis or a qualitative observation that currently exists? Like, for example, we believe there are too few credentialed providers serving the community relative to the demand that exists. That's something that, maybe anecdotally someone believes to be true or is felt in their program that they don't have the resources they need in terms of staff. Then how do you go from the data analysis to, what can we do to create a community level profile of the workforce that might include things like the ratio of workforce to children, to turnover, the various credentials that are among the staff, and then use that as leverage in the arena of policy advocacy. And how can we quantify some of those gaps and use those to promote things like access to more training, higher compensation to prevent turnover or maintain retention, et cetera. So this is just one example of the ways which we can continue to grow this connection between things that are observed on the ground to things that might have impact in some of the areas of decision making outside of the community. And finally, the last one that we'll mention here is taking advantage of transition periods. There's by no means a limit to when you can do certain things that improve your ability to be successful with data initiatives, but in particular noting that as many of you may know, Eastside Aligned has recently, it's in the process of having a transition period, which actually is a strong opportunity to think about refining structures, processes, visions, and other things to put data front and center. So whether that's something like explicitly naming data in any type of strategic planning and mission, thinking about, if you're thinking about capacity planning or filling a board seat, for example, seeking specific data expertise. So these kinds of steps. And while it's focused on Eastside Aligned in this particular case, some of these same action steps could be applicable to, for example, individual providers or other organizations in the community. Thinking out ways that you can set yourself up for success with respect to data is another way to think about this. So I will pause there. Any clarifying questions before we start talking about longer term action steps? This will be the last piece before we stop for our break. Okay, I'll keep going. And so for this particular presentation and this period of the analysis, we put most of the detail in the shorter term steps. But it's important to note that there are things that will happen longer term as well. Things like finalizing a governing body, detailing and finalizing at least preliminary community requirements, preparing for some of those changes in a more tech-focused data collection process, for example. Going through the legal process of setting up data sharing agreements with various contributors in the community. That might be the school district, it might be Head Start, it might be individual providers as well. Things like, making sure that there's sufficient organization or capacity within the coalition backbone to support, any changes in this work as well. And thinking about, again, this is longer term, but even expanding to include things like public health, social services, and legal system, and some of the data points that are being pulled in. So for example, being able to understand more about children in foster care or linking more public health related services with some of the indicators that would currently exist in the bounds of the early learning realm. So that was a lot. Hopefully that gives you a lot to chew on, to think about. We are going to take a short break. Feel free to get up, stretch, get a drink. Okay. So we have some time for questions and discussion. We do have, I believe, 2 so far in the chat that we can start with, but feel free to jump in. It doesn't have to be a question, it could just be a reaction or a thought you want to put in front of the group. I'll remind us all that this is a beginning of a conversation, and things don't necessarily need to be resolved here, but getting things on the table will be helpful for us moving forward into the next phase. And I also would invite, Kaylin, Ben to jump in as well. If there's a particular question you wanna jump in on. So I will start with Janice's question, which was, how can or will data gaps align between childcare, serve school age, and youth programming? Janice, did you wanna come off mute and add anything to that, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's something we just need to think about in our data gathering, because there's gaps that exist. And childcare currently isn't part of the out of school time initiatives that I'm aware of. And I think, if the data focus here is on early childhood, that can be something we address later.
Janice, one of the things I'll just note is that at the state level, we are bringing together childcare data. And one of the points of discussion is how to share that appropriately with communities. So that's, I think, definitely a question we want to explore moving forward.
Can I add something to that comment?
Please.
I mean, to the subject. And that is, I saw one of your inputs is the ICAM, I think it is, or something. And I don't know how you're going to resolve their input, but they're often outdated or not as accurate when you're using them for applications and different things like that. So I don't know, would you be duplicating that, or how you would be able to update it or add to it or make it more accurate when you use it as an input?
Absolutely. That is a challenge that we heard before. Ben works closely with the ICAM team as well, so he can probably speak in more detail to that. But what I would say just in brief is that with any input, there would have to be a process of aligning, what are the priorities? What are the questions we're trying to answer? To what extent does any given input help us get closer to that? And then, kind of take the good and leave the bad to a certain extent. So to the extent that the ICAM's data is helpful in answering the questions that, we want to answer, then that could be a potential input. If it's not, then maybe there's a solution that is more suited to local needs. It would be the first part of the response. But Ben, any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would just say that, ICAM is one of the major partners for the state work. They're actually helping to develop helping to integrate data across the different state agencies. And because we've been working with them and the agencies themselves, that has been a priority, is figuring out a way to get data on a more frequent and up-to-date basis. So, very much aligned with what's being suggested there. And hopefully we can, again, figure out how to best get that to the community.
I saw a raised hand. Forgive me, it was someone whose name is showing up as Z50R.
Yeah, that would be me, Lady Hicks.
Hi, Letty.
Yeah, hi. And excuse the back noise, so I get my water treated right now. But my question was from the last slide, showing the longer term. Not that this matter, but just out of just a thought. How long of a terms are we looking at? Or it's just as a phrase said that this is how, from here on out it would look, or is there like a number behind this, such as the longer terms?
Yeah, that's a great question, Letty. Thank you. I think that's also part of the next stage of work, is to really get specific about some of those things. So in this part of work, we, I think, are coming out of it with a good understanding of what some of the priority areas might be, and that then informs what steps we actually decide to take moving forward. So that will help us kind of with more detailed planning. But what I would say is those things on that last slide. So whereas the first section were things that could be started and perhaps even implemented within roughly a year, these are things that you might start or move towards within the year, but wouldn't really be considered finished, likely. And so it would likely be multiple years to be fully built out, but I can't give you a more specific number right now.
I did want to mention in this context, I mentioned earlier that this effort, this analysis project has been funded by the Governor's Office of Early Childhood Development through a federal grant that they have, the Preschool Development Grant. And I think I'm really appreciative of their willingness to support this effort. We have money for that through the end of the year. So a lot of the activities that Alexis has mentioned are funded for at least through the end of this year. And then I think some of the conversation will be, as was mentioned, what are the sustainable resources that need to be provided to carry this through longer term.
Thank you.
So I believe there's another question that was in the chat. So from Kevin related to the governing body, is this something that the Regional Office of Education can handle? So that is a good point. That is another entity in the broader community that was not specifically on that slide. So it could be worth returning to and thinking about more critically. None of the, or I won't say none of, I would say, you know, the intention of that slide was not to be a full workup of how each of those potential options could adjust to fit that role. But, you know, just a high level understanding of whether it would be worthwhile to kind of pursue that further and do more of that detailed planning of you know, how they might adapt to become in that role. And so at that level of analysis, certainly could look at and think about the Regional Office of Education as well.
Okay, and the reason I mentioned that is also for the purpose of data access. You know, you mentioned on one of the previous slides about how the state collects levels of data, which may not always be accessible to the entities that it's relevant to. And I would imagine it would be the same for any governing body that we go with on this project. You know, it may be great for everyone to contribute, but then how does everyone get data out of that pool? And does it become proprietary once it's submitted? You know, it's the same kind of thing. So my thought is that a regional office of education might be more neutral, you know, in terms of access. I guess the question would be, do all parties involved, or are all parties involved required to be governed by the ROE?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and your point about neutrality is an important one, or the point about who has access. And so there are, of course, different models that could exist, but I think one thing that would be important for the model that we're describing, you know, going back to that core design principle of collaboration, and also thinking about conversations that I know have happened, you know, for example, with the work Ben has done with the at the state level, is if, you know, if you're going to be a major contributor of data to the system, you know, it stands to reason that you should still have some degree of control and access to the product of that system. And so there you start getting into the weeds of you know, specific rules of operation in terms of the different agreements you can have in place, kind of governing how that data is shared, what goes in, what comes out. But the short answer is it's as a starting principle, yes, you would want the providers that put information in to be able to get information out, as well as have some degree of control over how their information is used. But the fine print of that is a process that you know, you have to go through, bringing, you know, those stakeholders to the table and collaboratively discuss what the various concerns, you know, hopes are in terms of that, and figure out a system and procedure that works for everyone. When we say governing body in this instance, the intention is not meant to be a black box where it goes in and never comes out. It's meant to be more of a convening entity that helps facilitate that process of helping the various stakeholders navigate how, you know, how are we going to, you know, what are we going to prioritize in terms of the types of inputs we're putting in, and also the types of inputs that we're going to be reporting back out. So does that answer the question?
It does, but it sounds like it's something that definitely needs to be discussed further. I do
Absolutely.
understand the last point as far as, you know, a body that kind of manages the collection, you know, but ultimately I think the usage of it would also be something to consider as well.
Absolutely.
Because that's going to inform decisions that are made on the community level.
Alexis, I just wanted to mention
Please.
one thing.
Yeah.
So Kevin, one thing is that I think not all I mean, you asked this question, but not all the entities that would likely participate either to provide data or get data would necessarily report into a regional office of education. As you know, early childhood tends to, some people fall into it and some people don't. I would also say, you know, and Stephanie, I don't know if this is something that you could speak to, or if this is something we need to explore later, is that, you know, I think there's some discussion about what the relationship between ROEs and birth to five councils are. So I didn't know if you had any thought on this question.
Yeah, I think, I mean, we are being a little cautious. Our districts are designed to fit the ROE guidelines. Like St. Clair County is my county, which is Region 50 in the ROE's district as well. But we are a separate entity from the ROEs because the ROEs do focus mainly on K up. And so even the programs that do report sometimes to the ROE through school districts still also then have to report elsewhere to the State Board of Education.
That's helpful, Stephanie. And I think, Kevin, I think that, right, so there are a lot of moving pieces here, you know, as the state stands up these birth to five councils, which Alexis did have in the presentation as a coordinating body, their relationship to the ROEs is going to need to be assessed, and that has implications for us as we continue this conversation.
Okay, great.
I think there's a lot of structural pieces to consider. You know, which data set do we go with? Is it program? Is it child? Is it workforce? So I think, so some of those nuances could be worked out, you know, like the technology, depending on what the data set is, technology may not be needed. And so Alexis, I think your example of workforce is one we all can identify with right now. And I think when you talk about inequities, it's clearly one that could illustrate and highlight some of the inequities, resource allocation and things like that come into play. And when you think about like low touch, Illinois Gateways collects all the workforce data right now for all programs, regardless of Head Starts, school districts, and childcare. So that's one kind of common thread, a golden thread amongst all programs. So I was just curious in your example if that might be one that might be good to start with, because it really just means you need to be in the registry and you have to update it annually. So it's essentially real-time data that, you know, Pastor Anthony mentioned as being a concern. We don't always have access to real-time data.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for bringing that up, Janice. And I think it also illustrates another point, which is that even if it might not be tomorrow that you have one system where all these different data points or all the types of questions that we are interested in can be together, you know, to the extent that there's the ability to start looking at some of these questions and then folding them in, of course, to whether it's advocacy, to funding applications, whatever it is, there's still things you can do now to come together and make collaborative decisions about interpreting and leveraging that data. And so I think that's a great example of ways in which it's almost an interim approach of ways you can work on increasing capability within the community related to data without necessarily having the final product or the target state in place.
Yeah, and Janice, I would just say, you know, one of the next steps that Alexis put out there is sharing, you know, exchanging learnings on some of the state data projects. You mentioned gateways. One of the conversations we're having with the state board is how to bring together both gateways data and the licensure data from early childhood license data from the state board, so that we can provide both of those perspectives to communities, both those individuals who are not necessarily licensed, have professional licenses, and then those that do. And then so that is definitely a strand we're pondering at the state as well. And I, you know, would be excited to talk about how that might play forward.
Are there any other questions or reactions?
I think part of it is building in some of this framework and including higher ed would also be an important place, because early childhood doesn't always have a data orientation to their prep. And early childhood gathers lots and lots of data, but professionals don't often know how to use that data once it's collected.
Yep, absolutely.
Janice, I just wanted to mention, and I think people may be aware, but there is actually a early childhood educators commission that's being run out of the Board of Higher Ed. So some of these issues are coming up in that context as well.
Well, I would just say, I think this discussion takes us back to our roots when Greater East St. Louis was selected as an innovation zone, and when Teresa Hawley was in the governor's office, and she came down and she said, you know, decisions without data are just feelings. And so it just brings me back full circle to that conversation.
Teresa is still a good friend and partner with us, so she has mentioned that conversation, and we look forward to building off of it.
And I like it when you make that quote, Janice. It do take me back to the roots. But I was just also thinking that once this data is collected, what's the next step off of this data that's been collected? Like, would there be like errors that need to be addressed, or what?
Absolutely, Letty. I think that's a great question that speaks to one of the concerns that was raised, which is it's one thing to have data and it's another thing to be able to act on data. And so I think in parallel with planning for how do you change how you collect and analyze data, part of what this is also trying to get at is how do you think about building capacity, building structure, building opportunities in the community to think about collectively, interpreting and prioritizing action on data. So, one thing, for example, Caitlin and I have talked about is what would it look like to do a community data workshop where when there is data available, having a variety of stakeholders come together to talk about what it means, how it shapes the priorities of the community in terms of where they spend time, attention, resources in the coming year to make changes based on what they learned, or how does it change what family groups, what community organizations advocate for. And so I think the challenge, but also responsibility and opportunity of the community is to turn this into something that motivates action. And there's a point coming in the chat, which is that a concern is that data changes so quickly, especially in early childhood. Absolutely, and I think that's one of the core concerns that this is hoping to address is and was also brought up earlier, is that we need data close to real time to be able to act. If you get information that's already older, can you feel confident that what you might want to act on is and still the best path forward? Letty co-signing there, all the time. And I think that can feel overwhelming at times, but I think it also does present an opportunity to be able to, particularly over time, when it does change, look for what's staying the same, or look for what, maybe is trending in a negative direction. And that can bring some clarity as to, where you focus attention. If there's something that's changing rapidly, but changing rapidly not in a great direction, that could be, something that becomes a mission critical priority, or it can be something that, you rally around in terms of advocacy, resource allocation, et cetera. And so the data does change, but that can also be very telling. So I see Evan has a hand up, but I'll also just reply to the second question from Letty. Was data be shared because some data cannot be shared? Absolutely. So that goes into the part about, spending more time in detail related to reporting, which is that, so part of the job of that governing body piece would be to pull out the pieces of the data that can be shared in aggregate, so that it's, of course, protecting privacy, but also identifying trends and themes that are in a position that can be shared and understood, by the community at large. Evan, you want to go ahead?
Yes, thank you. And I'll just echo what I wrote in the chat, just expressing gratitude for your time and effort on this presentation and the work that led up to it. A question I have, and I think it was touched on, we got some things to figure out in terms of governance, who's playing what role and so forth. Obviously, I think for anyone, any entity who plays in this role, a concern would be available financial resources to support the staffing that would be really required to utilize the different systems and do this work. And so I'm curious, in the interviews you've done or the research you've conducted, have you learned about different funding opportunities either through the state directly or beyond the state that could support this type of work?
Yeah, the short answer is that no, we haven't focused too much attention on that right now. That is something that is top of mind going forward, is the resource question of how does this become sustainable. One thing I can say from previous work and research is that with any major change or any type of initiative, if it's not staffed and supported appropriately, it's not likely to succeed. And so being able to answer that question and understand where those resources can come from will be a critical next step towards ensuring success.
Yeah, Evan, and I know we're at time here, and I would just say in closing, first of all, I wanted to thank Alexis for her amazing work here. She's just done such a wonderful job pulling together all of this information. As you mentioned, I think it's really exciting to see this get off the ground, and this, for us, is not just an opportunity. We're very excited for East St. Louis, but we think this is a model that we can take to other regions around the state to figure out how better to bring data and resources to a variety of different partners. It really is our mission in the next few weeks. We do have additional funding to continue to have that conversation about the budget, as Alexis mentioned. I think we can develop something that I hope will fit into the resource needs of East St. Louis, especially on the technology side. I think on the governance side and how you maintain this over time, that's also a big question. And so we've got to figure that out. Just as Alexis said, our experience has been that this governance component is critical. And it's true at the state level. We have governance bodies that are coming together on a regular basis to support conversations about how to integrate agency data, but it's also really important at a local level as well, because we've got to have people involved in how we're using the data and such. And our experience, for example, in Chicago, is that the governance body is what really makes this move forward over time. So we look forward to having that continued conversation with yourselves and others about how do we make sure that is something we can put in place moving forward. But I want to thank you all for participating in this, in this effort and supporting Alexis in her efforts here. But I'm super excited about what's been presented today.
Yes. And I know we're coming up on time, but I just want to also add in my thanks back to all of you all. I've said to many of you, I'm a visitor not only to East St. Louis, but to the state of Illinois, the Midwest. I'm from the East Coast through and through. And so to be welcomed into the community, to have the great hospitality of when I was able to come visit down in East St. Louis, and to have the openness and the willingness from many of you to be part of this conversation has been invaluable. I also just wanted to give Kaylin a chance to wrap up or share any last thoughts before we all hop off and move into the next phase of this conversation down the line.
I won't speak for long. I'll just continue the trend of thank yous to Alexis, of course, who's done such an amazing job in the work, to Ben and John and everyone at Ed Systems who has really been instrumental in helping from a technological perspective, which is not my background. And then of course the investment from GOECD. So I'm really excited to continue the conversation with you all. If there are specific things that are on your heart or mind that you really want us to talk about next time we come together, if you want to throw those in the chat. Otherwise, I am here and available to chat offline with you. But thank you so much for spending time on this today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you all.
And all of our contact information is there. Feel free to reach out. Thank you all and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks.
You are too.